So we would be hoping that our partners, maybe the RCDs, could host on a Google Drive or something like that, could host a spot to put any attachments, maybe slides from speakers if folks are interested in those, as well as the video for the session. So Heather and Chris and Lucas, if you are all on, I don't know, maybe raise your hand, use the little raise your hand function if you would be willing to host that information on a Google Drive or somewhere. I saw Heather raise her hand. Thanks, Heather. And your video's on, Heather, so if you wanted to close your video. And Lucas raised his hand. Thanks, Lucas. Appreciate that. And I'll talk to Chris. I think we can get it on Solano's as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. I want to go ahead and get started so we can respect everybody's time, and we'll get into our content here. Introducing Rich Cassell. A lot of you already know Rich. He's been with NRCS for a very long time as a DC in Santa Cruz, and has a lot of experience with post-fire restoration. He is a certified professional in erosion and sediment control, and I understand was one of the first to earn that certification. I think that we will all have a lot to gain from Rich's experience, and I will turn it over to you, Rich. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll let you share.
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Let me open up my slideshow here. Share tray. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on. Okay, what's going on here? You see it now?
Yes.
You can, okay. Let me get...
Amanda Beaton needs to turn her...
Of course, we don't want to start with that.
Well, yeah, skip to the end.
Okay, here we go. Everybody see this? I mean, whoever's...
Yes, we can see.
We can see it. We can see it. Okay. Once again, welcome everyone. I'm Rich Cassell. I'm a certified professional erosion sediment control specialist and have been for 40 years, post-fire storm restoration specialist as well. Been assisting NRCS over my 43-year career and through almost 4 years since I've retired. So going on 47 years of working for NRCS, district conservationist for almost 40 of those years in Santa Cruz County and San Mateo County. Been working on fires since the mid-1970s. Most currently in the last 4 years since being an ACES employee, I've been working all the major fires mostly. Didn't work on the Paradise Fire, but assisting our field offices post-fire with site visits and also developing a lot of the information that you hopefully have at your fingertips now, and much of it is on the NRCS state website. So a lot of what I'm talking about today is actually in writing, and perhaps, not perhaps, but many handouts have been made from my presentation. And there's a few new ones too that I've added. So I'll get started. But before I get into the nitty-gritty, there's some things to keep in mind. And what I'm speaking of right now is also on a handout as well, so no need to take any notes or any of that sort of thing. First of all, we have to make sure that we help property owners make informed decisions by providing our advice in an understandable way. Our job is not to prove to folks how smart we are and use a lot of scientific jargon and acronyms and what have you, but to put the information, even if it's science-based information, in a real understandable way, even more so than we ever have, because I know we're pretty good at doing that anyway, but people have a lot of things on their minds right now. Outside of the fire, we've got COVID to deal with at the same time. They've also, many folks have lost everything. And in some cases, you're going to be visiting these sites for the very first time with the landowner seeing the property since it's burned. So we have to keep that in the back of our minds. And saying that, there's going to be some emotion, there's going to be some loss that they're going to be sharing with you. I've had folks actually collapse in my arms, seeing their homes burnt down or, the remnants of their life. So step back and, be compassionate. I know we all are, but be prepared for the emotion that might go along with your field experiences. Because I know I had a tendency to kind of hold back, because I get totally involved with people's emotions, and it comes back and affects you later on. So just want to let you know it's perfectly normal, but to hear their stories. We need to keep in mind that many people have lost everything. Many people are underinsured. I know in the wine country fires a few years ago, 65% of the people that lost their homes were underinsured. I know just in Santa Cruz County, what we're seeing down in the emergency center, many people are coming in and saying they're not insured at all. So when they've lost everything, they don't have insurance, they don't have any leftover money. Let's be careful about the gold-plated solutions that we might have in our minds as to what they could do to protect their properties before this winter. Also, the information that we do provide with it to them in writing, make sure you know what's in that information. So read those handouts and fact sheets, know them inside and out. We want to make sure that our word in the field is consistent with whatever written material that we're giving to them. Also recognize that you don't have to give them 20 handouts because we have 20 handouts. You need to recognize that one size does not fit all, and that you need to consider that every site has its own set of variables, and to tailor those handouts to what just is pertinent to their situation. Whenever possible, to work in pairs or to take a multidisciplinary approach. I know we're going to be spread pretty thin. Sometimes it's difficult to do that, and there'll be times when we'll all be going into the field by ourselves. I would suggest in any of the more remote areas to always work in pairs. It's very dangerous out there. We're going to talk about safety in a minute, but it's always best to have someone along with you. Recognize that fire is not only natural in the landscape, but so is soil erosion. So we can't give anyone any sort of guarantee that with following our advice, even if we tell them to do nothing, that there's no real silver bullet or there's no 100% guarantee. We're not going to be able to stop it all. It occurs even when we don't realize it. Us as soil conservationists recognize that it is always going on to some extent, but it's going to be accelerated following fire, and we're just trying to minimize damage and to reduce the amount of erosion that takes place following fire. So keep that in the back of your mind. And also make sure that you're speaking and have the permission of the landowner or their official agent, and try to stay on their properties where you have permission to be. And, and this is hard to do sometimes on rural properties because you're investigating the site and all of a sudden you're on someone else's property. Keep in mind, you're a government employee, and some people are very sensitive to that. And so we want to make sure we're as near as we can where people's property lines are, and that we're working with. I always double check. I ask the person as soon as I get on the site, are you the property owner? I actually use a form that they sign saying such, but I know that a lot of our sign-up sheets provide that information to us so that we know that we're only assisting folks that have requested our assistance. We're not out there knocking on doors and we see something and we want to offer our services. So folks generally have to come to us in order for us to assist them following fire. I think when people do contact the office, if you can find out whether or not they have neighbors with fire damages or are concerned or in a neighborhood of sorts, that if they could speak to their neighbors and let them know that we're coming out on a certain day, that would be great. Because just like the fire didn't recognize property lines, neither does erosion potential, neither does runoff. So when we can look at the bigger picture and work on a neighborhood level or with neighbors, we're going to be more effective with our treatment measures. So we don't have one neighbor doing one thing and right at the property line, someone is doing something else. We don't want to rubber stamp what the landowner or what a contractor may have already started to do or wants to do if you don't feel it's technically sound or it's what you would recommend. I try to use the landowner's ideas as much as possible, so they're more apt to be vested in that decision. But in some cases, you may see some ridiculous things out there in terms of their attempt to control erosion or runoff, or even like in this picture, debris from their site. So always hold back and make your technical professional recommendations based on the site-specific variables that you observe. So be careful not to start throwing out different practices before you've really had a chance to see what's actually happened on that particular property. I think it's good to have some identification that you are official, government employee or RCD employee or, second, post-fire responder, because there are a lot of people out there nervous about looters and trespassers, and it gives them some confidence that they can see that you're official, whether you wear something around your neck, ID, a name tag, an NRCS shirt or hat, something that looks more official. Try not to show up in private personal vehicles, something with government plates and or government insignias are help to make us look more official. Some people may require some follow-up either over the phone or email or request something in writing, and some don't want anything in writing. So I know that we will be providing some documentation from our visit. We need to have those notes. And most of the people that I've worked with all want something in writing, so I make a landowner version of those notes. I'd be happy to share a sample of what that looks like if anyone is interested. So those are a few things I just wanted to start off with before I get into the slideshow. So this is an overview of what we're talking about this morning. Safety first, and always safety first. Then we'll be looking at a post-fire assessment, which would include evaluating site conditions and the degree of damage and how we go about that. What some of the potential issues and impacts are from wildfire. Some recovery strategies. So they're kind of overarching strategies before we dive into specific treatment practices. And then if we have time, we might talk about some fire safe tips for when people are going to be asking this question, because if they've lost their homes or their farmsteads or what have you, and they're going to start building back at some point, they're going to want to know just some, in general, fire safe tips. So their properties are more fire safe, at least the ones that they build back. And then my top 10 list is basically pretty much a summary of everything I'll be discussing in my presentation this morning. So starting with safety first and safety protection, head protection, hard hats, good idea when you're in forested areas and woodland areas, especially early on, but it doesn't matter throughout the time you go into the post-fire landscape. I believe in wooded areas, it's always unsafe because large branches can be falling, trees can still be falling. And in some cases, some material may still be hot. So keep that in mind. Some burning under the ground may still be taking place as well. So nose and mouth protection, N95s are really good for the debris from homes. Dust masks are fine out in the open landscape, but if you're out there walking around homes and structures that have burned down, that debris is extremely toxic, particularly on a windier day, and particularly before there's any rainfall that may settle some of that material. Excuse me. So if you have an N95 or need one, and you're going to be out on sites like the one in this background, the dust mask does not cut it. And let me tell you, because I've worn a dust mask in these situations and end up with terrible headaches for several hours following my visits. Foot protection is very important. I've had nails go through my feet on more than one occasion, and that's wearing with sturdy boots. So be very careful anyway walking around. There's a lot of unknown hazards. Some you can see in this picture. There's a swimming pool in the background. I've been on sites where swimming pools have been completely covered up and you don't even know there's a swimming pool under the material. So like a big trap door or something, find out, what's on the site owner before you just start walking around it. I would say it's best not to walk through these sites, to walk around them, stay as far clear of them as possible. Some people may not want you on their site. These are their earthly possessions and what have you. They don't want you to be looking at what's left. So get permission if you feel a need to see something within the debris, but make sure you have proper foot protection and nose and mouth protection. Eye protection, particularly if you're going to be out there and it's going to be windy. Or I don't think you would be using any tools at this point, but obviously you would have eye protection if you were doing anything where you were operating machinery or a chainsaw or something like that. Hand protection in the way of gloves, be good and handy to have in the truck. You don't have to wear them all the time, but if there's things where you're going to be picking things up, that may be a good idea. And protective clothing, obviously no shorts, but long sleeves is a really good idea. And So anyway, there's some safety protection for your personal body. Safety tips for the fire area. Once again, the fire damaged trees, some of them may still be burning or burning under the ground early on in this process. Some of them might even spark up again. I've been on many sites where there's a flare up on while I'm there, so the toxic ash, we talked about that. Unstable slopes and debris flows. Some slopes may exhibit dry ravel, which is basically dry erosion on the landscape, steep erosive, soils anyway, now no vegetative cover on them. Very slick to be walking on slopes with a lot of dry ravel. I mean, you can sink into your waist on some of these slopes with so much dry ravel occurring following fire. Debris flows, even without rain. If you had an intense storm following fire, it's not uncommon to have debris torrents or mudslides or debris flows if you have enough rainfall. The Montecito debris flow, I was there the day before and the day after of that debris flow in Santa Barbara County that killed 22 people. There hadn't been any rain for 2 weeks. And then on January 9th, 2018, a half of an inch of rain fell in 5 minutes, which is equivalent to like a 6 inch an hour rainfall. And that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back in the fire area, and all hell broke loose. So keep that in mind. You might be out and there might only be maybe a chance of rain that's forecasted, but it's very different when a cell just opens up and you may be on a very susceptible site. So safety first. Rockfall, a lot of rocks and boulders may have been perched up on hillsides and slopes, may be sitting behind trees and brush that was once there, and now there's a moonscape with a lot of exposed rock on the landscape. And it may look like it's stable, but depending on the rock, a lot of it's fractured. The fire actually broke some of this rock apart. Even large boulders are now smaller boulders. They're more prone to following fire. We talked about sinkholes in the way of swimming pools. I almost fell into a burnt out, abandoned redwood septic tank once that I didn't see, that was covered up, and it wasn't in the debris area. It was outside the debris area because it was a septic tank. But also there's a lot of burned root systems, burned underground culverts and drainage systems that were plastic around home sites, and the ground is unsteady and it could collapse. Even burned trunks of trees create these large caverns. If I had a dime for every time I fell, in a hole from a tree that had burned out or a culvert that had burned out, I would be, I don't know, I wouldn't be a millionaire, but it's very unsafe, okay, in terms of there being dips in the landscape or things that would have collapsed. In fact, I had shoulder surgery 6 weeks ago. Of all things, I was on about a 16-foot picking ladder, and one of the legs in the picking ladder actually collapsed in a gopher channel. So that was something I didn't see on the surface, but just the weight of me on this ladder, I thought it was sturdy enough, but I came down lickety split. Luckily, I only broke my shoulder and didn't, break my back or was killed. But so I'm very, very conscious of what might lie beneath us. So be careful. Utility hazards are still going to be out there. There are some sites that you may be getting into before even the landowners have, like I said, have been there yet, or anyone to even evaluate what dangers might still exist from utilities, especially some of those folks that are off the grid. Roads, so even getting to some of these sites, the roads may in fact be unsafe. the culverts, don't assume that they've been, they're all metal culverts, because a lot of them are plastic. And even if the fire just burnt up to the road, the culvert could be gone. And you almost have to get out and look at the culvert, because the plastic culverts may burned out and they leave the impression that the culvert is still there. I've actually had to get down on my hands and knees and touch the ground to see that the culvert had been vaporized and only the impression of the culvert was left. So if there wasn't that much cover over those culverts before, not having the reinforcement of the culvert under the road can be a very precarious situation. Your vehicle may be the first vehicle over that road in some cases, or a long driveway to a house site. And lo and behold, that road could collapse with your vehicle. Then there could be displaced wildlife. I've seen rattlesnakes on some sites in the Santa Cruz Mountains following the Summit fire, but there may be deer or other animals still like disoriented, displaced. So be conscious of that. And then, excuse me, stream bank erosion and flooding may be an issue in some areas. Even downstream of the fire area following fire. So once we get into some rainfall, this could be a hazard to you as well. Okay, so excuse me for a second. Getting into fire assessment and evaluating the site conditions, assessing the site before deciding any treatment. Once again, you may be having a larger conversation with the landowner about their losses, how long they've lived on the property, if they have a land use there that you're not aware of because all you see now is a moonscape or just skeleton vegetation on the landscape. So get some history on the property in your conversation. And particularly any fire history. And if the property knows when the last time the property had burned, if you don't already know this from, a recent previous fire, it's good to know, that. It's good to know what they did in terms of having a fire safe property, a fire safe landscape prior to the fire. Some people, had great fire safe, landscaping, but it still burned. But it's good to know that, because the more work that they did prior to the fire, chances are the fire burned cooler rather than hotter in those situations. And when it burns hotter, it does more damage to the soil and to seed banks, and for the potential for regeneration and such. So getting some history on their pre-fire landscape and fire history is important. That also will help us determine what the intensity of the fire was on their particular property. Recognizing that BEAR reports and CAL FIRE reports provide mapping of intensity and severity of the fire. Those are good planning tools, but when we're down on boots on the ground on specific properties, it's not that detailed. Kind of like our soil survey isn't that detailed when we get down to smaller acreages. So we'll talk a little more about that in the slideshow and how that comes into play. And then concentrate first on disturbances from the firefighting effort. If they had any firefighting efforts, one of my first questions out the door when I speak to landowners to know if they have any, was any dozing done on their properties, were fire trails cut, was backfiring taking place? Are there fuel and fire breaks, that were on the property? Even road systems that were reopened to fight the fire? Because chances are this is going to be one of the areas that you're going to want to concentrate your site visit on. This is where we're going to see more erosion and the potential for the concentration and diversion of water on the landscape. Then obviously structural losses and the debris issues that are affiliated with those structural losses, because even before the debris gets cleared, you're going to be on sites, some debris may not get cleared until well into the winter time or even after winter. Just depends on whether or not the landowner is electing to have debris removal done with their own means or their own insurance, or whether or not they're going to elect to use the FEMA program. I will say if they use the FEMA program, almost everything on their site is going to be removed, including the soil. And the soil in upwards of a foot or more could be taken off of the site. They're going to have a depression left, no sidewalks, no patios, no foundations, everything goes. But if they elect not to do the FEMA program, they might be able to save a driveway or a retaining wall or an important tree or something that's just heat damaged or what have you. So that's one reason why some people elect not to have the FEMA program. But debris removal can run into the tens of thousands of dollars. I've heard as much as $100,000 plus for debris removal, and I've heard estimates as low as $20,000. So it's all over the map. So we talked already about slope stability being a post-fire situation, erosion and sediment hazard. It's going to depend on how steep the slopes are, what the soil type was, whether or not they have hydrophobic conditions, the level of ash, the intensity of the fire, the amount of vegetation that's left on the landscape. And not just that, but if the vegetation is gone, the root systems still providing some protection. Tree hazards, obviously, we'd like to keep as many trees as possible, even the burnt ones, because just cutting trees down does disturb slopes and soils. And if it's not needed, I would say leave it. When I say it's needed, then it's creating some hazard to life, to high value property improvements, to important access, maybe to a stream crossing, a bridge, or something of that nature. But otherwise, tree cutting is site specific to the site. Whenever in doubt in terms of it creating a hazard, then at least prune it back or cut it down, but don't cut everything down. I always say to leave everything until the following spring or summer. A lot of trees will sprout back, and not just from the stump, but from higher ups in the trees, just depending on their damages. And then roads and drainage systems are a high priority as well. To evaluate those first. It's really easy to get caught up if somebody has, 20 acres of land and they're concerned about their 20 acres of land. And immediately you can go to, where the structures were, where the drainage systems were, their roads and their access to the property, any of the disturbances from the firefighting effort. Concentrate on those areas first, and then you can look beyond that, including where any streams or water courses may be on the property, particularly if they're close to where there's been structures that have burnt down. I'm very concerned if the debris is not removed before any significant rainfall, that material lickety split ends up in a water course. May even go into a drainage ditch first, but just kind of follow the line, because this is nasty stuff that we don't want into our streams, affecting fish and wildlife resources. Obviously, the topography of the ground may influence that. Some sites are pancake flat, and others have quite a bit of slope, and mobilization can be quite rapid following fires, particularly if the site was burned pretty severely and there's nothing holding or buffering this runoff before it does reach a water course. So obviously climate is a factor, rainfall, microclimate of the site you need to take into consideration, even aspect of slope, south facing, north facing, sun exposure. These things come into play in terms of regeneration, water holding capacity of the soils, and, future plant choices, all those sorts of things. Water resources and supplies may have been impacted. So observing, learning about maybe where private wells are, water sources, pipelines. we talked about plant community. It's good to know what was there before. You might not know that. Even the landowner may not know that because they don't know plants. So, but in some of the areas around homes in developed areas, that plant community doesn't necessarily was native plants. It could have been invasive landscape plants in their, in their landscapes. And hopefully this, following this fires, that there's an opportunity to plant something back that's more fire resistant, non-invasive, non-natives, but more natives that have maybe are more drought tolerant, and so on and so forth. So then obviously T&E species, cultural resources, to always, as we do with all of our planning efforts, consider those resources as well when we're assessing properties in site conditions. So the fire impact on the soil, again, is a very site-specific call, but keep in mind that on burned homes and structured areas, the fire, if it took the home, barn, or structure, it burned in upwards of double, triple, even quadruple the temperature of what the open landscape burned at. I've seen house sites where the fire burned in excess of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I actually worked with a property owner that was a welder, and he had a cast iron tub that melted or was compromised. And he told me, he says, it takes 3,300 degrees to compromise cast iron. So this is the kind of temperatures we're dealing with. And on one side, I swear the soil actually was glass. It actually melted the soil where it burned so extremely hot. So in those situations, I doubt that there's any seed bank or surface root systems left to resprout. The damage to soil and fire impact in around structures is pretty extreme. And these are areas where if we did anything with practices, this is where we would be getting the most bang for our buck, not way out in the open landscape.
Hey, Rich.
Yes.
I wanted to take a little pause. We did have one question that came in before we get too far away from the topic. Can you comment on your experience with any customers that use the California Department of Resources Recycling and Recovery Program, or CalRecycle, for debris removal? Do you know anything about that one?
I know about it. I don't have any personal experiences. I've advised people to contact them as an option. And people that I know that have used that were very happy with their service. But, it probably varies depending on which fire and who you're dealing with. But yeah, that's another option. Sorry, not to mention that. But, whenever there's the potential for anything to be recycled or recovered, or to, it's a conservation use of what's left on the property. I mean, a lot of properties were fire damaged, but the whole property is going to have to start from scratch. So there are a lot of things on these sites that can be recycled and reused instead of just be taken to some dump site. Yeah, good question though.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah. The presence and depth of ash is important. If you have white ash, that's an indicator of where the fire burnt very intensely, very hot. Chances are it did kill seed bank, and it is going to limit the ability of regeneration of plants. So again, those areas are areas to concentrate on in terms of, the potential for sediment and ash mobilization and that sort of thing. Keep in mind, people want to seed in these areas too. You can't seed ash, okay? So seed bed preparation raking ash around sites that might be seeded in the future. And we'll talk about seeding in a second, but it is very site specific and it's still a very controversial practice. But where it is recommended and where it is a site specific call, you can't just have people broadcast seed on ash. It's a waste of time. It will not germinate. So look at the land use, understand the land use that was there before, but also look at the land uses surrounding on the surrounding properties as well. It's important to understand what's going on beyond the property lines. So some of the wildlife impacts on the soil itself will affect the soil health and the recovery of that soil. As I mentioned, it's very complex and very site specific. All these variables we talked about, we need to take into consideration and make that determination on how severe the wildfire impact was on this particular property. And now, like I said, it may be really extreme in one part of the property and very, very light in others. In fact, in some parts of the property, the fire is probably the best thing that could have happened to the property. In other cases, it just devastated. It's very devastating for the resources and for the property owner. So we talked about all these things. I want to kind of move on with following slides. The intensity, as I mentioned, it burns hotter and destroys plants and roots and resident seed banks. But the lower intensity fires, even they may be cooler, they can smolder on the soil and still have a significant impact on the biological and the physical and chemical properties. So don't be too quick to dismiss, oh, it's just, it was grassland, it burned really cool, I don't see white ash. The fire could have still affected soil health in some form. Again, it can affect erosion hazard, it can alter the water holding capacity, and the cumulative effects can affect its productivity, its fertility, and its biological diversity. So now some of the potential issues following wildfire include such things as trees falling. You think that was pretty obvious, but like I said, they can be falling throughout the fall and winter. It can always be an unsafe situation. Recognize that if it is something that is a danger to folks, and those are only the cases when I would recommend that come down. In the picture in the background here, I've seen folks, go in on a very unstable slope like this and just cut everything down because it's obviously burnt beyond almost recognition, but you're doing way more damage to the slope. You need to wait. You can see all the dry ravel on the slope. It's one reason I put this slide in. There hasn't even been any rain. This picture was from the Atlas Peak fire in Napa County. Very steep. In fact, this is very close to where the fire started. So it left for a very unstable soils and unstable slopes. So the less disturbance, the better in these areas. So getting in and doing vegetative work is not advisable. And even seeding this, forget it. Straw mulching it, probably not a good idea either, not even to create a strip somewhere. I mean, in some sites like this, the most we can hope for is to do some sediment control at the toes of these slopes to protect waterways. So rockfall, we talked about rockfalls earlier, debris flows, we talked about that. Downstream flooding, we talked about that, stream bank erosion. These are all potential issues following fire. Other potential issues include power outages. Keep in mind that, and again, a safety factor is being able to have an emergency communication system, and you may be in areas where there's no cell coverage. When I worked the big Sur fires in 2016, there was absolutely no cell coverage anywhere once you got more than 500 feet off of Highway 1, in some areas not even on Highway 1. So there are areas in Area 2 that may not have the best cell coverage or no cell coverage, and where we are in some of these burn areas. So keep that in mind, especially in an emergency. You may not be able to use your cell phones, and there may be no power for hardline communications as well. We talked about road damages and total road washouts, that we come across. So even your Google Maps, and other, GPS kind of stuff may not work for you. You may go down several miles only to find out you have to turn around and find another access. So try to find this information out from the landowners or others before going into the field, because you may have to find an alternative access route. I know that we've already received in Santa Cruz County some property requests where there isn't access to the property yet. So we're holding tight on some of those. So let's see, invasion of native plants is a potential issue. We'll talk about that in a second, and Fish and Wildlife issues. We're going to be called out to many agricultural areas, and between the FSA programs and the NRCS programs, we're going to be able to help some of our growers with their crop damages and losses, their infrastructure damages, their damages to even some of the conservation practices we helped put in for them in the past. So luckily we have some of those issues. Now, when we get into the actual crop damages, you may be asked, there'll be questions, and FSA will have teams that will be going out to look at crop losses and orchard and vineyard damages. But there is, some people are going to be quick to remove their crops. They think they're gone, particularly when you get into orchards and vineyards. This is a picture from Santa Barbara County in terms of damage to the avocado orchards and stuff. Some would survive, and some others. Some things we can tell folks where we know we have clear evidence of the potential of the plant to survive. In other cases, I would wait for other experts to make that determination. And obviously, damage to agricultural water supply may certainly be an issue, or to the water quality that's used on the farm. Now, some other potential issues that we might not normally consider following fire is just that person that we're working with, that landowner's ability, to understand their knowledge level as it relates to the installation of possible needed corrective and protective post-fire measures, and to install them properly, and even if necessary, and then beyond that, just to perform necessary maintenance that might be necessary. This is a picture of, everything gone wrong in terms of a landowner thinking they're helping a situation by throwing some jute netting on the slope and some plastic and sandbags. If you're going to spend the time, money, and effort to do a practice like this, then I say do it right or don't do it at all, because this would only give you not only a false sense of security, but it in fact might be making the problem worse. So getting out of front of the landowners, our opportunity to get out there early in the process is really important, because when one property owner does something like this, a really bad example, believe it or not, other property owners start copying bad examples. And all of a sudden, we've got jute netting everywhere. We got plastic sheeting everywhere. We've got sandbag dikes and diversions and, all over the place. And these practices, when they're not installed according to specific plan or recommendations by, a qualified professional, can be terrible, can make things worse, and unnecessary disturbances, really slowing down any potential for regeneration, increasing runoff, actually even doing damages to neighboring properties. I can go on and on with these emergency practices. Now, you may come across a site like this and you're going, oh, this is someone that did it right. They got a contractor, and they installed everything right, but there's almost nothing in this picture that was installed properly. So you need to look at these practices closely. If you come upon them after the fact, in the background, you can see the neighboring property put plastic down. Wrong thing on many levels, particularly if the plastic is not clear. So plastic will kill everything underneath it. It basically increases runoff. 1,500 square feet of plastic results in 1,000 gallons of water coming off of that plastic with 1 inch of rainfall. And typically that's going on a fire burnt landscape. So we're adding more water unnecessarily to the landscape with plastic. The picture in the foreground with the straw wattles, they're high and dry. They're on top of the jute netting. They're not keyed into the ground. The jute netting is loosely indented over a landscape that's not uniform. There's not soil to jute netting contact. It's sitting on top of cutover vegetation. As you can see in the lower part of the slope, it didn't even need to be disturbed in the first place. This landowner spent thousands of dollars. From other projects like this that I've seen, this landowner spent over $10,000 doing this, maybe $20,000. So unfortunately, what do you do? In this case, do you take it off and do something else? Do you make more disturbances? Do you try to retrofit it to something that would actually work? Do you just leave it alone because, it's not going to, make anything any worse? It is what it is. At some point, it needs to come off the landscape. But at any rate, a contractor's ability to understand and install needed corrective practices is also a potential issue. And believe it or not, there are many contractors out there will even call themselves an erosion control land contractor. I've worked with many of them. Some have said, I've been doing this for 20 years. Don't tell me what to do. So you have to kind of tread lightly because a lot of times you're going to be meeting with landowners and their contractors. So you don't want to be tarred and feathered right out the window. You need to listen and kind of provide some tips that make people pay attention. Anyway, I could go on and on about all the contractor stuff. Almost with every fire, I've had the opportunity to speak to contractors in a workshop environment. Might not be a bad idea to do a Zoom training for contractors working in the fire areas so we can get out in front of it. So at least they have some of our information. So if they're going to do this work for property owners, that they're doing it correctly. But we can also armor the property owners so they're armored with good information when they do hire someone, so that they know when the practice is being installed correctly and when it's not. So some of the overarching recovery strategies. The do nothing strategy is basically letting nature be your first fire recovery practice or your first best management practice. I know for NRCS that do environmental evaluations on all our projects, we always consider the do nothing alternative. But how often do we ever select it? Seems like we always select the one with, a dozen or more practices. But in this case, that do nothing alternative comes in more often than you would think. Beyond that, then we go to less is more, recognizing that one size does not fit all. Saying that, even in this picture, the straw wattle that's in a burlap sack at the top of this slope is unnecessary. It's at the top of the slope. There's no overland flow coming from anywhere where that would ever come into play. It's really not keyed in either. It does conform to the landscape, but saying that, it just shows that it wasn't keyed in. The straw mulching looks like it's okay, but if you really look closely, there's actually netting underneath the straw instead of the other way around. The netting, if you put netting down, it should go over to hold straw in place. You don't put the netting down first and put straw on top of it. But you shouldn't put the straw on too deep. Again, less is more. No more than 2 inches. Less is more. If you go 4 inches, you're going to slow down regeneration. If you're seeding, your seed probably won't even come up. It'll be too thick. So one size does not fit all and may not even be necessary in the first place. And once again, if the wrong thing gets out on the landscape, others are going to do what neighbors are doing without getting any other advice. So don't monkey see, monkey do. Some of the broader, yes.
Rich, there's several questions that have come in around mulching. So before we move away from mulching, one question is, I think on the slide with the very steep slope, you said you wouldn't even suggest mulching on that slope. Is it because it wouldn't actually help or because it would cause additional harm? Can you explain your reasoning a little bit on that one?
Well, I did the one that had a lot of dry ravel on it.
I think so. The one that was looked
First of
very
all,
steep.
First of all, it was so steep, the straw wouldn't even stick on a slope like that. It was in a very inaccessible area, so I wouldn't want to be bringing in heavy equipment to do anything, even hydromulch equipment, because typically folks might think that that's an idea to hydromulch, dry ravel and areas that you really can't even stand on because they're steep. They're even potentially unstable. That's one of those sites, if you get on a site like that, you could be down to your knees in dry ravel. Straw is very slippery. Let landowners know that do this themselves. It's like stepping on a banana peel. So you kind of have to start at the top. You always have to have your feet on solid ground, not on the straw itself, because it'll slide out right from underneath you. So it is a hazard just spreading it. Yeah, and again, just stepping on the landscape, making trails, hand labor trails on the landscape. It really is minor, if anything, that you're going to do. And if it's so steep that you have to put down netting on top of it to hold in place, a lot of disturbance, because in order to put netting down, it has to be a uniform slope. So the slope has to be prepared so that you have some uniformity. You need to cut the vegetation. You might have to cut stumps down to ground level. You just do way too much disturbance to the slopes when they're that steep for straw. I will be talking a little bit more about straw when we get into practices. But one thing, we were just, you need to keep in mind with straw this early in the season. In previous fires I've been working with in the last few years, they've all come sort of at the end of the season. We haven't had much time to plan, and people want to start doing things quickly. Anytime you have fires in the summer, early fall, you have to wait to put the straw down. The straw is a fire hazard. Let me say that again. Straw is a fire hazard. If we start spreading straw all over the wildland interface and on fire breaks, particularly in fire breaks where the fire only went up to that and it's still unburned on the other side, it's a fire hazard. It's not only a fire hazard early in the season, the ground can still be hot enough to ignite the straw. Okay. I believe the CAL FIRE recommends if the ground is at 100 degrees, and you might not know that unless you have one of those temperature gauges, it could in fact ignite loose straw on the slope. So not quite sure of the exact details, but I'm saying you don't have to get the straw out immediately because it can still be a fire hazard, and particularly around the perimeters of these fires or within the fire area where some areas didn't burn completely through. If they happen to start up later, I mean, I've seen hot spots occur a month after the fire was declared 100% out. So we don't want our measures to catch on fire. It wouldn't be good.
All right. Thanks, Rich. You might be getting into this a little bit later, but there were a couple of questions on different materials for mulching, wood or brush mulch, or the jute netting that you already mentioned, plastic netting.
That's all coming later.
Okay, we will wait for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So some projects may require permits, particularly if we get around some of the water bodies and streams and stuff. All of us are probably aware of that, but certainly with retaining walls, a lot of retaining walls were burned out around structures and have to be removed or have been so compromised that they'll have to be, replaced. And we don't want people to think because, the government's out on their property and we're recommending that a retaining wall be replaced, that they don't need permits to get them. And they should be working with a lot of experienced and licensed contractors. And there are a lot of ambulance chasers. There's a lot of unqualified people doing work out there. So you can't overemphasize that to folks. There's a lot of people literally trying to make a buck on the post-fire situation with landowners. It's very unfortunate, but a lot of these folks come from outside the area. They come from other states, and they're opportunists. Others are well-intended, but they still don't know what they're doing. So on slopes, as we mentioned earlier, and as I just mentioned, don't disturb potentially unstable slopes and don't cover with plastic. Reduce the amount of soil disturbances, and if necessary, manage the runoff and sediment at the bottom of the slope. Like I said, some of this stuff we're just going to have to let go. We can't stop it all. Now we get into runoff and drainage control. Consider the runoff management for us formula of slow it, sink it, spread it, store it. I just had NRCS put up on the NRCS state website the drainage booklet that the Santa Cruz County RCD has out. So that's a really excellent publication to refer folks to for home sites in particular, but I think it also has some pertinence to other burned properties that are in need of some drainage and runoff management. Use diversions cautiously, and this is where people first go when they think about runoff control, is to divert it. You may just be diverting a problem or creating a new problem, and when you divert the water, you concentrate water. Always remember, when you control water, you control nature. And sometimes that doesn't end so well. In fact, more often than not, it doesn't. So looking at some treatment practices now, we'll break them down into short-term, long-term, and emergency. Short-term, generally the first few years following fire. Long-term are more permanent practices, like retaining structures, or they might be catch basins or culverts or something of that nature. And then emergency is first winter only, but recognizing they're very high risk. They're also require maintenance, and a lot of people don't think that when they think of some of these emergency practices. And also they may only give the property owner a false sense of security, which I always say sometimes is worse than knowing that you have a hazard. So let's get into mulch. First of all, there's a lot of nature's natural defenses out there. We want to work with nature rather than against her. So as I said earlier in the program, consider nature as your first best management practice. There'll be a tremendous amount of leaf drop. It's already occurring probably in some areas, but as we get into the fall, particularly where our vegetation was heat damaged or smoke damaged, or maybe the fire was lower intensity, and so we're going to have leaf drop from plants that typically are not deciduous. And as you can see in the background from this picture, there would be no need to be putting straw mulch on a slope where nature's already provided that slope. So let's not make this a lot more difficult than it has to be. Not only that, by putting more mulch on top of adequate mulch is only going to impact and restrict the ability of seed regeneration from natural seed bank or regeneration of plants. Using slash and cut brush or cut plant parts as in a lop and scatter techniques is a good practice, particularly on dozer disturbed areas, loose soils where we know there isn't where there's been disturbance, fire breaks, for example. And it's something that CAL FIRE will do, where the material is available along these fire breaks, but they oftentimes will just put in some water bars and call it good. But lop and scatter, the technique there is to make the material no deeper than your kneecap, and to scatter it, literally scatter it. Don't try and place it perpendicular to the flow. That's why I don't like log barriers on slopes. I had NRCS take that back sheet off of our website. You want to have it more like pickup sticks, more helter-skelter on the landscape, mishmash of material. And you want to step over it. If it's one of those sites where there is equipment, then to run over it so that you get that slash into the first couple of inches of the soil whenever you can. If not, just having it on the surface is fine. When I say natural stone and gravel and rock, this was already exists on the site. I mean, some of our sites, they might be more than 50% just stone and gravel and rock, you know. That's also an impervious surface. That also breaks the force of raindrops and takes the energy, that erosive energy, out of that raindrop. You know, a raindrop hits bare soil at 30 miles an hour or more and can displace soil particles 5 feet in any given direction. So if it hits a leaf, if it hits a stone, gravel, whatever, a boulder on the ground, it's going to take some of that energy out of it and spread it around. So other net forms of mulch may not be necessary if we already have something on the ground surface. And even ash is very absorbent in the early rains, and it will set up like a crust. So on some sites, the ash is actually a good thing for early runoff as a soil protection. Now, looking at various types of mulches now. Mulch reduces rainfall impact, as I just mentioned. It helps to reduce erosion, slows runoff, traps sediment. What? Someone say something? Adds organic matter and soil and retains moisture for plants, both the ones that may be planted at some point or the ones that are already there in the landscape. This is a picture of correctly placed straw. It's not so deep that or thick that you can't see soil through it, and you can see plant material already generating through this. Whether or not you use rice straw, most people will recommend that. I do too. Sometimes it's not available. Okay, so we recommend something that's not available. Make sure whatever you're recommending is available, or you can tell people where to get it. Otherwise, you know, it's an empty promise and people will just do something else instead once you walk away. If they don't use rice straw, when you tell folks get certified weed-free straw, I have yet to find anybody that will certify straw as being weed-free. Even rice straw can have seed in it from upland plants, because we just don't know how it was stored, how it was transported, what it was mixed in. So any straw has the potential to provide weed seed. Now, saying rice straw, keep in mind, it's light, it's fluffy, it sticks together. If laborers are putting this out on the landscape, they sometimes get lazy and they start throwing flakes of it out on the landscape. Well, that doesn't do anything. You have to make sure that they pick it apart and spread it. When I say it's light and fluffy, it travels in wind more easily than other forms of mulch. So it can blow around the landscape. It does last as long as any other mulch. So it is a one season kind of thing. You don't have to scrape it off the surface at the end of the season or anything like that. Wood chips are a good source of mulch, but once again, not too deep. You know, as wood chips break down, they tie up nitrogen. They can actually slow down the regeneration process and seed germination, depending on where they're at. But a lot of people want to use this. There's a lot of sources of wood chips out there as people start cutting things down and want to reuse the material, which I'm all for. There's a place for it. I put a handout together on straw mulch versus wood chips, when and when not to use one or the other. So I won't go into any more detail on that one. If anyone wants me to send them, if they don't have that, it might be on the NRCS website. I think it's one of the ones I told them to put up on our website. Compost is a form of mulch. Gravels might be okay for parking areas, you know, alongside roadways, areas around homes where they're trying to create the future, you know, fire-safe landscape. So gravel's a mulch as well. Hydromulch, very selective, very site-specific. Don't get carried away with hydromulch. I could put a whole slideshow on just on hydromulching. We do have an excellent handout on hydromulch, but recognizing it's not, you know, the miracle drug either, and there's a lot of downsizing to hydromulching. Anybody is welcome to talk to me if this is going to be something that's going to be big in their fire area, or they want to be armored with more information about when and how and why. I'll be happy to talk to them about that. So we'll talk a little bit about straw wattles, filter rolls, silt socks, a lot of different names for these things. They manage and slow runoff. They can help to control erosion and sediment. They're not dams. A lot of people will call them, wattle dams or straw dams or whatever else. They're a filtration device, a sediment control device, runoff slowing device. Proper location and installation is critical, and that they be installed properly and not by, a well-intended opportunist, contractor. This particular picture, the landowner spent $5,000 having these 4 rolls put in his lawn that didn't burn. That wasn't even needed. I wouldn't even have recommended anything on the site with the exception of maybe throwing some straw mulch on the blackened areas. But otherwise, he spent $5,000 for nothing as far as I'm concerned. The thing that's interesting to note here, the neighbor wanted to do the same thing because I met with the neighbor, but the neighbor luckily contacted me before he did the same thing that this landowner did. But they're not right in every situation. They're going to get sprinkled all over the fire area, all over the landscape. I would say I'm being very conservative here. At least 50%, as much as 75% of them are either not needed or installed incorrectly or poorly located. We have 2 handouts now on the details on how to install straw wattles. And I think at least one of those is on the NRCS website. Make sure that's a handout that you give if you're recommending straw wattles. So erosion control blankets netting. I recently did a new handout on this as well, jute netting, erosion control blankets, sort of the pros and cons. But again, proper installations is essential. We talked about this earlier. I don't want to spend a whole lot of more time on straw, but usually it's a very expensive insurance. And actually, I think in most cases, not always a good idea, but a lot of people like it. They think it gives them sort of peace of mind, but only if it's done correctly and that there's something underneath it. Again, netting's really, its first purpose is to hold mulch in place. So seeding and revegetation, as I mentioned, it's a very complex, very controversial practice following fire. Let's wait on nature. This is a picture in the background from the Thomas Fire. This is grass that came up after the fire, just within a few weeks following the first storm event. And that was in that fire. This was late December, and we still had grass germinating following fire. Some pruning of vegetation might be in order, but this is going to be reserved for around homes and roadways, access points. Like I said, maybe around a bridge or a stream crossing, something to that effect. People are going to know what to seed. In some cases, sterile wheat or barley can be added to a native grass mix. Every area is going to have its own specific grass mix that is pertinent for their area. So again, we could have a whole slideshow just on seeding and vegetation. I think one of my handouts on seeding is on the NRCS website, and I'm trying to update others. Folks from different RCDs have sent me theirs. Trying to come up with one. It's still not going to be, one size fit all when it comes to grass, but something should be commonplace for all of them in terms to seed or not to seed. In most cases, no widespread seeding for sure in the watersheds and open space. There may be an opportunity for range and pasture seeding depending on what was there before, but that's a site-specific call as well. So minimize tree cutting. Don't be too quick to remove damaged trees. We talked about that. They're still serving a purpose. Anything that hits even a skeleton on the landscape is better than the disturbance that takes place by removing that tree. The raindrop, again, has to hit that before it hits the ground. Trees still are slowing runoff down over the landscape. And once again, slash and selected areas can be used for soil protection as long as it's not too deep. There's going to be a lot of invasive plants that are going to want to kind of come back in, following fire. Sometimes it's the first plants. That's another reason for finding out what's on neighboring properties when you first make a property visit, or what was there before. Even if it was a landscape plant, it may in fact now be an invasive plant to the wildlands, because there's nothing for those non-natives to compete with. So getting at these natives early in the process is going to be crucial, and when their populations are small. So drainage treatments, they may require enlarging existing systems, creating backup systems, and a backup system, say on a road culvert system, might be to create a critical dip. Keep in mind that everything is undersized after fire. Even if it was sized appropriately before fire, everything is undersized. There's going to be more runoff, more debris, more sediment in the water. Chances of things plugging are very high, and maintenance is going to be required after every single storm where you have existing drainage systems. You may have to eliminate existing systems, some that are high and dry, some that no longer have an outlet. You may not want them to come into play at all. Oh, I skipped one. Here's a culvert. Most culverts are all going to require some inlet and outlet control. Even if they had them before, you need to evaluate that, because these are a collective concentrated source of water that can do a lot of damage to the post-fire landscape. So we can maintain those inlets so they're functioning and that there's adequate velocity dissipation at the outlet is extremely important. K-rails and deflection measures. This is one in Santa Barbara County. I actually recommended the landowner put it up on their own, but once again, it's safety first. The measure like this might give a landowner a false sense of hope, but it is one more defense against a mudslide or debris, or high water from impacting their home. There are temporary forms of this and more permanent forms of this. I believe that they all should be installed according to a design by a proper professional, and that placement is absolutely critical. Stream bank erosion, again, this could be prevention strategies around streams. It could be a whole slideshow on its own, but basically some tips is not to have folks dump anything. They're going to want to dump burnt brush over banks and into stream channels. Streamside properties are going to need to be working with their neighbors. Any spot treatment that takes place, it could cause new problems. So we need to look at reaches of streams. If there is an opportunity for some kind of bank protection, we need to maintain bank vegetation and a buffer along the tops of streams and waterways. So, straw wattles and straw strips and protecting vegetation that didn't burn along these areas might help to buffer some of the sediment from making its way to streams and waterways. Also to try and to let people know that these are very temperamental situations, and they need to consult with experts before getting into our stream and riparian areas, and for them to monitor debris jams and fallen trees and erosion and high flows during the winter. Some debris jams may be a good thing. It might be, again, one of nature's ways of slowing runoff down in our waterways and trapping sediment, further up in the watershed where it's going to be doing some good. But obviously in areas where it might jam up behind a bridge or a culvert crossing or something like that, not so good. So these are the areas that we want to monitor very closely.
Hey, Rich,
yeah.
I'm going to jump in on you just to give you your 10-minute warning,
Okay.
and then also to throw a couple of questions out there.
Okay.
One question was on breaking up contours on hydrophobic soils, thoughts on using foot traffic or vehicle tracks along the contour to break up that slope length. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it depends on how deep the hydrophobic layer is. It could be right near the surface, or it could be 6 inches deep. Depending on the soil type, the more coarser soil types, the hydrophobic layer typically is a little deeper than closer to the surface. Usually hydrophobic conditions are more prominent in coarser texture soils to begin with, as opposed to tighter and denser soil. So it may not always exist. So doing a quick test with a water bottle to see if it exists first and foremost, instead of wasting your time thinking it's there when it's not there at all. And doing more than one test, particularly if it's an area where you're thinking of doing some seeding. Because once again, why disturb the soil if you don't need to? But if you are going to do seeding and you do have a crust on the surface, whether it's from after the first moisture and the ash is set up, or you do have hydrophobic conditions, or there's other indications that the seed is just going to be laying on top of the soil. Your seed germination is so much higher when you can get some soil coverage. And if you can't get that, a little bit of mulch coverage is going to really heighten the success of that germination. If you do any hand raking, again, you just scarifying the surface. You don't have to go very deep. Now, saying that, if you have a site where the hydrophobic condition is 4 to 6 inches deep, I'm not really recommending you disturb the soil that deep just so you can put some seed on it and grass. Keep in mind, on steep slope, grass does very little for slope stability. Okay, it isn't a slope stabilizing practice. If anything, it increases infiltration and can be almost the wrong thing to put on slopes. When you're dealing with slope instability concerns, you want deep-rooted plant material. That may already be there. Even if the top of the plant is gone, there are still root systems in the soil, and some of those are not dead, and they may be closer to the surface, and they still might be providing some slope protection. So keep that in mind. The grass, on the other hand, can act as a wick. It can actually increase infiltration. It's an surface erosion control practice. So that's the goal, and it's in selected areas, particularly areas that have already been disturbed, like dozer areas and areas that were maybe dozed around a house, or they're loose. They've already broken up the hydrophobic layer or root systems. This is a place for grass.
Thanks. There was one other question just about seeding wildflowers for pollinator habitat. So I don't know if that will come later in your talk, or if you wanted to address that.
No, I think it's a good idea if you're using a native mix to incorporate not just grasses but forbs and wildflowers, and just for beautification. It's also helps with the emotional feeling of when your landscape comes back for color. It helps the person that has to endure the blackened landscape, and then to see poppies coming up or something of that nature. It gives them sort of some renewed faith, and it's a beautification on their property, and makes them feel better. Not to mention what it does for the insect habitat, the beneficials, and the whole biodiversity of the landscape. So excellent question. And those wildfires will depend on which fire and which soils and which climates and what have you. So maintenance is going to be needed after every storm event, not just at the beginning of the rainy season, and repair and address those defects as soon as possible. You know what? I think I'm going to skip the fire safe tips for the sake of time, but I'll let you read them quickly as I'll go through these slides. It's just 2 or 3 slides, but a lot of them are things that we've all heard before. But wherever we can do this in the post-fire landscape. And we're also going to get calls from folks that their neighbor's house and property burned, but they came through it with flying colors, but they're still concerned. What can I still do on my property to make it more fire safe? So we're going to get those questions, and we're going to get questions from people that are even outside of the fire area, because we're still in the fire season. And with all these California wildfires, they're going to want to contact us to get advice on what they can do to make their properties more fire safe. We may not be able to go out to their sites individually unless they happen to be in the fire area, and we're already going to be visiting other sites. But keep in mind that that's one. These are some things we can give them as tips, but there's a lot of websites, and they can go to the CAL FIRE website to get more detailed information on on creating a fire safe landscape. But also saying that they might also consider fire-resistant building materials as they build back their homes and structures. I also have a plant list I developed with the Native Plant Society following the wine country fires for the Central Coast and Bay areas on basically the post-fire fire-resistant plant covers, tree shrubs, grasses, ground covers that are also drought tolerant and somewhat deer resistant. It's not the end of the list, but it's a list that has the support of the Native Plant Societies and also local plant ecologists here in Santa Cruz County. And also I assisted the Native Plant Society with the Fire Recovery Guide, which is also on our state website. It's a very lengthy colored guide that we developed. I helped basically co-wrote with the California Native Plant Society. So check that out. It's there. You can also get a free copy of it as well if you want your own solid copy of it. But a lot of the erosion stuff that I'm talking about is in that guide as well, as long as some of the considerations for plant materials and wildfires. Okay, very quickly, as a recap, my top 10, what landowners should consider if fires cause damage to their property is, first of all, to get help from licensed experts, NRCS, RCD, some of our other partners before they do anything, because as I mentioned, they may not have to do anything at all. It just depends on their situation. For them to respect the laws of nature, recognizing that using drainage ditches and diversions should not be the first thing you think of is to move water around the landscape. That one size doesn't fit all. So don't really copy what your neighbor's doing or what you see, the county doing or what someone else is doing. That your property is unique, even though you might be just across the street and your property may seem to be very similar to the one across the street. It's still unique, and it may require a whole different set of recommendations or practices or none at all. Minimize the soil and slope disturbances. No urgency to remove burned trees and plants. Look beyond the property lines. Help neighbors to work with their neighbors and others on the neighborhood level, even on the watershed level, on the road association level, on a homeowners association level. Anytime we can work on this level and get our practices more, big picture and more working together within the neighborhood or within the community, the better all those practices are going to work together. That's why I've got this sort of fence line picture on this slide, is that a lot of times these practices just end right at the property line, and sometimes out of sight, out of mind. Someone's practice works fine on their property, but they're causing a problem for the neighbor with their practice. Also in the background, you'll see that jute netting was installed incorrectly. You see how it's tented and lumpy over the landscape. There's nothing underneath it. And they had to cut a lot of vegetation to actually even get it on the slope. So just really a waste of time and effort, and they may have made the situation worse. So again, emergencies measures come with a very high risk. They provide a false sense of security. They require a lot of maintenance, and they can actually cause new problems or make the problem worse. So, but a lot of people have a lot of comfort in putting something on. It just makes them feel good. So make sure if you see this, because you might see it as soon as you get out to the property. And this is a big question that comes up all the time. If you see something and you think that emergency measure is going to make it worse or create a hazard for the landowner, then, use good judgment, but you may be telling them to take it off the landscape. Now, there's some liability that goes along with that, because what if something happens after they take it out? Are we liable for telling somebody to take plastic off their slope because we think it's a greater hazard, but then they have a problem and they think, well, that problem wouldn't have happened if I didn't take the plastic off. I'm blaming NRCS. So it's a situation by situation situation. So just keep in mind, doing nothing or less may be best. and always consider nature as your first best management practice. But at the end of the day, there is no silver bullet. When it's not safe, it's not safe. And we're not in the business to tell people that if you do all these things, you can sleep soundly, or that your property is going to be okay. If the property is still a property in which they can live on because their house is still livable, they still need to have an emergency plan and an exit plan. If there's a debris flow, if there's an erosion event, a flooding event, what you have it. And not only an exit plan for a vehicle, but make sure that people have an exit plan on foot. A lot of people don't even know what's beyond their property lines in these rural areas. And sometimes people are seeing what's beyond their property lines for the first time because a fire has made it so. So now's the time to see how they can escape their property, if they had to in the future and they couldn't get out with their car. So thank you for your patience. And that's my slideshow for this morning.
Wow, thank you, Rich. That was so informative. I know I learned a lot, and I hope that we all got some pointers. We will follow up with getting the written materials, the handouts that you mentioned, collected and posting those. There are a couple more questions here, but I think we can probably carry those over to later. What I'd like to do is, this is not on the agenda. I'm ad-libbing here, but I think let's take a 5-minute bio break. By my clock, it's 11:04. So let's be back at 11:09. And everybody just do what you need to do, and we will join back up in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy.
Hey, Rich, you're still sharing your screen, just so you know.
I forgot to hit that button. Thank you.
So, Rich, can I ask you something real quickly?
Sure. Whoever's still on the line, happy to answer any questions.
Great. This is Jeff Rafe Snyder. You said that the primary purpose of netting is to hold mulch down. How does I should know this, but you put the mulch down first and then the netting? I'd heard that the netting has got to have contact with the soil.
I know, but that's the thing. You only put the mulch down very lightly. Like I said, an inch to 2 inches max. So it's really laying on the slope, and it's laying on a slope that's been prepared for netting. What people don't realize is that you have to have a very uniform slope. And generally in rural areas, if you're not in a neighborhood or something, or in a development or something, our slopes are undulating. They're not perfectly smooth, which begs the question: is it a practice that should even be recommended and on 90% of the sites? Because in order to do it properly, you need a very uniform slope, and this is used typically more in like new developments, like subdivision developments and big commercial developments and stuff where a lot of grading has been taken place. It really doesn't have the application, without a lot of intense installation, considerations to be done right. So if you have the ability to create that, I would say reserve those areas to areas that were already severely disturbed, like they were already bulldozed or they were already severely graded. So you're not really adding insult to injury. You're trying to make a bad situation better by smoothing things out and placing some straw. And if that slope is so steep that it needs netting, then by all means, use the netting. But then put the netting in properly, have proper overlap. It needs to be keyed in at the surface, at the top of the surface. It has to have the right length of staple. Some soils are really sandy, so you need a longer staple. So there are details that go along with the proper installation of the jute netting. Like I said, in most cases, straw by itself may be all that's needed. It's only on those slopes that are so steep that the straw cannot be held in place on its own, or without, some help with shoveling it into the slope. The other thing that can be on big, long and steep slopes, if you just put in a straw strip, might be all that is needed, and it reduces and minimizes the amount of disturbance on the slope. Yeah, you may still have some erosion, but breaking that slope down into more than one part helps to reduce erosive velocities and volumes and creates kind of a buffer for a long, steep slope by creating, because sometimes it's just not economically feasible to straw mulch a half an acre. And, I've seen this situation over and over again. I think it's overkill, and certainly the depth of it is overkill. But yeah, you put down, I'm not saying that netting by itself isn't going to do any good, because obviously, raindrops are going to hit the netting first, right? So there is some protection from the direct impact. And as water moves over the soil, it may actually trap some sediment. But there's lots of pictures I could show you of erosion underneath netting without anything underneath it. And this is netting that was installed properly. So you need that good contact with the ground surface. And if it has a thin layer of a straw underneath it, then that netting is going to function optimally. It's not going to be something that's going to just sort of help.
All right. Thanks. Glad you got a little Q&A in there during the break, although Rich might need a break now. We're going to move on with the next portion of our training, and we're going to go to Kristen Norman, who is our Area 2 Rangeland Management Specialist, talking about grazing lands and fire recovery. So take it away, Kristen.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to discuss the fire recovery and grazing lands and those that are also intermixed with forests. This picture here is a recent picture I took from the recent Sonoma County fires. This is the Myers-Briggs fire. You can kind of see in the back on it, it's kind of a patchy burn. And there is more intensity further up in the forested area, but it burned downward towards the coast here. So it seemed to slow down and was a little bit patchy on that. So Jeff's going to help me out with the slides. So you're going to hear me saying next, by the way. So Jeff, go ahead, next. All right, so with the initial impact overview, we're going to review the charred landscape and interpret the burn severity, black ash versus white ash. Species composition can shift post-fire, and especially with weedy species in forward germination. There's also an initial loss of forage, but green up post-fire is not that far away. Seeding concerns with do's and don'ts and pros and cons we'll look at. Soil disturbance can also be broad, especially with those dozer lines. And then we're going to talk about some of the structures, livestock structural practices that get typically lost in fires. In this picture here, this was also the same, the Myers-Grade fire on the same property, but this is on the upper part of the ranch. And you can see the excessive dozer lines the landowners put in as a kind of a last attempt, really trying to save this property, but it was just too much. So you see some different severity of burn, some white ash off in the distance, and then up front, besides the dozer line, you're going to see a little bit of green up there too, which is kind of nice to see, kind of a hopeful that some of those perennial plants made it through fine. Next. So with charred grasslands and low burn severity, although initial looking at them, the charred landscape looks pretty devastating. But as you look closer, you can see perennial plants surviving just fine. With plant resiliency, grasses with finer leaves and dense growth forms, such as like with purple needlegrass, are more susceptible to destruction by fire. Those that are taller growth and maybe with some more dispersed leaf patterns tend to be more fire resilient. And if it's a fast-moving fire, then it helps the grass crowns will survive just fine like they did here. You also can see some of the gopher activity here with, so you have different gophers, and rodents in the soil being pushed up, which also supports the low impact of the burn in this area. Next. So with determining viable seed in the soil, as you see in the picture, you have quite a bit of seed there on top of soil, as well as a little bit of perennial grasses trying to survive too. There are a couple of ways that you can test for seed viability and germination. There's a tech note that was put out by NRCS with the Plant Materials Center. It's number 36, and it kind of goes through this, the TZ test, which is a tetrazolium test. It's a really good way to test for seed viability and germination. It's done in a lab, and it requires seed gathering prior, and you do this by setting a transect doing random samples. Results are separated by species in the lab, and the seed count is included in the results. The results are based on the seed response of the living cells and dead cells, and they will come through as being red versus colorless with this water-soluble tetrazolium salt test. This test can be a little bit costly, but can be extremely helpful. More information on this is in this tech note, and I added it to the files in the Teams Fire Recovery, and it uploaded also to the chat files. Another option you can do, by the way, to go back to the TZ test, sometimes you can get that in 48 hours if you need to make a quick decision. Or you can do an at-home seed germination test. This is where you place the seeds under a wet paper towel or within a wet paper towel, and you keep them moist. You should see seed germination in probably about 10 days. And this can also be done as well as placing in a shallow pan with soil and see about the germination, just keeping it moist. Then you can count the seedlings as they germinate, and this will give you an indication of seed viability per square foot. Okay, Jeff, go ahead next. So this is also the Myers-Grade fire, and in the, you can see some areas up in the wood area that's pretty high burn severity. This area is kind of an intermixed grazing area, so it's kind of a good overview of a different intensity in this site. So it's kind of, this site to me kind of was a little bit disturbing to see this, because it really showed it was lower on this upper end. It really got going in the forest canopy, and I think there was a lot of disturbance up there, and there was a lot of white ash underneath that canopy. Go ahead next. So for forage loss and annual rangelands, this is an overview of forage loss and recovery rate. So for the first season, post-fire on grazing lands, you can expect to have 50 to 70% of normal production, which can also have forb or weedy species dominance, as you can see sometimes with some of these grasslands, if there is seed in the soil or if the site prior to the fire had a weedy species dominance to it. And then for the second year post-fire, it can be about 20% less production than normal. Then by the third year, you can get closer to what is normal. For a comparison of what is normal, forage production can be found in ecological site descriptions for the area, or also you can use the Web Soil Survey, as we don't have that many ESDs available throughout California. Go ahead, next. So for species composition shift, this can be common post-fire. So you can take a grass-dominated grazing land and it will turn and shift to forbs or weedy species. What I found in some of the Southern California fires a long time ago down in the eastern side of San Luis Obispo and Santa Margarita area, that after the wildfires there, they came back heavily populated with poppies and lupins. So that is just something that you can expect to take place. It's common, but it can slowly transition back to post-fire to grass species as they germinate and they compete with those forbs or weedy species. Sometimes in situations where if you had a persistent seed bank prior, that it might be something they might look at as doing some kind of herbaceous weed treatment control if the undesirables are just too persistent. Next. So with forage loss, there's always the big question, to seed or not to seed. So I have three main questions that I always look at. Is seeding necessary? And what is the goal? The goal could include soil stabilization, establishing native plant communities, competition for heavy weedy species that germinated by the fire, wildlife habitat improvement, and then providing forage for livestock, which is extremely critical. And then if the decision is, yes, I need to seed, then what do you seed with? For seed selection, just make sure that it's suitable for the site and also your vegetation management goals. As a seed mix is much better than a single species, as each species has strengths and weaknesses. And this gives a greater biological resiliency to disturbance such as drought, fire, or heavy grazing. It also prevents a monoculture on the landscape, which can happen pretty significantly if you do something like if you just seed annual ryegrass, it's going to dominate and you'll end up with that kind of a monoculture. For NRCS, there are different seeding practices to address the specific resource concerns and goals. Critical area planting is an example for highly disturbed sites such as dozer lines. And you can use range seeding, rangeland seeding can be better for wide ash, low seed viability sites, or you could also use it for dozer lines. If you need something, just a quick establishment cover, I would opt for something sterile. And some of those seed options are like a triticale, white oats, or wheat, and can provide this really quick cover to prevent erosion. Next. Actually, I'm going to go back real quick and just talk about timing. That's extremely critical as well. You want to plant in the fall, just before or just after the initial rain. So I would say just half an inch of precip. If you're able to use a range drill, and if the site's accessible, that's a good option too. The use of a drill ensures that you get good seed protection with the soil with that contact, and you can actually drill prior to the rainfall. If you've got a broadcast, a lot of times the topography does not support using a no-till drill. It has a lower success rate due to the lack of seed and soil contact, especially if there's still an ash layer. So I would really wait on that until you know there's going to be precipitation or you have the initial precip already takes place so that they have a better chance of that germination. Next.
Hey, Kristen.
Yeah.
Before you move away from that, Rich had mentioned that seeding into ash was not a good idea, that the seeds would not germinate. So can you talk a little bit about if you would need to do some site prep prior to drilling or not?
With drilling, you're going to be drilling down into the soil layer. So that soil is going to help germinate it. So you wouldn't need to. And Rich, please jump in and let me know if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen that to be a problem on some of the rangeland settings I've seen use a no-till drill post-fire. It's more when you have that seed sitting on top of the ground in the ash because it does not get that soil contact. So you might want to think at that point of doing some kind of minimalized raking if you need to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Kristen.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then as far as your, when to graze, that's critical too. It's best to wait until the year after to allow establishment and also for seed shatter. A good way to tell if a plant is ready is, I call it the pull test. So basically you're just gonna use your fingers and you tug on the plant itself in the ground. And if they have enough root establishments to stay put, then I would say the cows can graze them. But if you I have found like early germination, the seedlings are young, and you start to pull on them and the soil is moist, they'll pull out. That cow is just going to rip that plant right out of the ground. So it's best to wait. Okay, so for dozer lines and erosion concerns, these two photos show various dozer lines and cuts on steep slopes that would probably benefit from erosion prevention seeding. You could use either critical area planting or rain seeding for either site. And I think you covered some of this too already, Rich, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So with a fire, there's always quite a bit of structural practice loss. Some of these are fence, water troughs, water tanks, pipeline, solar pumps and panels, corrals, barns, are all typical related livestock structure losses. NRCS can assist with all of them except for the last two, the corrals and barns. What I find is with the tanks and troughs, if they're anything poly or the pipeline and the panels, anything that has any plastic component, it's going to melt. And something to be thinking about too with fences is when I first went out and looked at this site with this fence in the photo, it was fine. And it was maybe a couple of days after the fire. And then I went back about 5 days, 6 days later, and it had burned because it was smoldering in the ground. So it had actually burned up within a week post-fire. And so it's really important to really take a look at that and also be careful when you're out there, because what you see above the ground is not quite what's happening below the ground. Next. So I have some ending thoughts with just kind of what I call beyond the burn zone. I want to talk to something I call the domino effect. It comes down to what you do with your evacuated cattle for the long and short term. You may take them to another ranch you have, but it cannot sustainably support them, and concerns of overstocking do arise in the situation because then you have impacts to that property. Having extra animals can also go against your lease terms if you lease the land. So that's always going to be kind of another conundrum in that situation. You can try to buy hay and try to feed them until the burned ranch is ready for grazing, but you got to keep in mind that, you know, it gets costly. If you're going to be feeding alfalfa right now, it's like $225 a ton, and organic alfalfa is $300 a ton, and that cost adds up really quickly. Sometimes it's best to cull, sell part of the herd, but that is a very tough decision to make because you can't buy your genetics back, and you're losing part of your income in the future. So when we were out there assisting livestock producers in fire recovery, I just want everybody to keep in mind that there are not so apparent financial constraints that they're dealing with. We look at that as that, you know, well, their house didn't burn and this didn't burn, but they still have a huge financial impact to them. And we need to be thoughtful of that moving forward because they have a very long road in recovery. Okay.
All right, Kristen, before we transition, just a couple of questions.
Sure.
One is about native grasses. If the long-term goal at a site is to promote transition back to natives, would immediately post-wildfire be a good window of opportunity to seed those native grasses?
It would be a good opportunity. If you're going to do that, I would really take a look at what's actually growing out there. If you have any idea of what was growing prior, it's going to tell you what that seed bank is that you're going to be competing with. If you have a seed bank that's kind of weedy, you might want to deal with an herbaceous weed treatment first to address that. But you could, depending on what that weedy species is. So if you wanted to do like the TZ test, it's going to tell you what you have growing, and that will give you a good idea of what your competition is. But yes, it is a good, if you want to transition and the site will support it, it's a good time.
Thanks. And then one more question that has more to do with programs. And the question is, do the water troughs, fencing, and et cetera have to have been implemented with NRCS funding to get assistance with replacement? And I know that, okay, thanks. There's also a program through Farm Service Agency as well that definitely not. But yeah, go ahead, Kristen.
Go ahead. Yeah, so what I look at is that interior structures, I would look at NRCS. One thing NRCS cannot address is a boundary fence. And that there is, if you know, that's crucial because you want to be able to keep your animals, right? So they're just going to stray. So I think the boundary fence is like the most critical for the property. And that would, I would lean towards FSA's ECP program. And then anything else within, as far as pipeline or any kind of water systems, interior fencing, we can address. But the barns and the corrals, holding facilities like that, we do not address.
All right, thank you. And I think we're ready to transition to Jeff Kelly, who is our Area 2 area forester. So Jeff, I think there you are. Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you. So we'll be talking about post-fire recovery on forest land. This picture here is a pretty good representation of what many of you will see on some of your site visits. This was Kincaid fire back in October, which was like 10 years ago now. But this picture was taken in the spring, and you see a lot of grasses and understory species coming back up. You know, as Rich and Kristen both talked about, sometimes if you just wait a little bit, you will see some recovery and let nature take its course. One thing I wanted to go over was the mosaic pattern of fire, just because you're going to see a lot of different things out there. Just because a fire goes through an area doesn't mean the effects are equal on every parcel you'll visit. So there are two things when we're talking about fire. There's fire intensity, which refers to the heat energy released during a wildfire event. And you could have anything from low intensity, which the fire is staying on the ground, moderate intensity, where you have intermittent crowning, and high intensity, where essentially everything is on fire. And mainly the crown it's moving through the crown. And in that situation, topography doesn't even play as big a role when it gets into the crown. Wind is really what is pushing that fire along. So you see a lot of different patterns out there on the landscape. The picture on the right represents fire severity. So it's showing the effects of wildfire intensity on plant communities, which essentially one way to think of fire severity is the amount of biomass consumed. Typically, fire intensity and severity are correlated. So if you've got a low intensity fire, you're going to have a low severity impacts to your vegetation. The picture on the right is an aerial photo from the 88 fires in Yellowstone, which at the time, you know, people were fearful that it was going to be really impactful to the entire Yellowstone ecosystem and everything was going to be burnt up. But just the virtue of fire, you're going to have, as I mentioned, mosaic pattern. You're going to have, even in this situation, they had low severity, mixed severity, and high severity fire impacts in really the same forested parcel. And because of that mosaic pattern, what you're going to see out there is going to be very site specific in forest situations. A lot of that has to do with pre-fire forest conditions, and that, of course, is tied to fire history. For a lot of the forests in the region we're in, the historical fire intervals were far exceeding what those intervals typically were. So a lot of these forests, if we're thinking of just fire return intervals, were overdue for fire. Part of that is that, and due to that overdue of fire, those fires built up. Lots of trees. The tree density was very high. Smaller trees, oftentimes, or smaller trees in the understory, so a lot of ladder fuel buildup. And sometimes species composition have been changing as well. So our oak woodlands oftentimes are encroached by Douglas fir just through the virtue of professional process. So the post-fire forest conditions we're going to see out there are based on those pre-fire forest conditions, of course. And then really the fire severity. So the impact to the trees, how much is lost through that fire. And then soil burn severity, which is very important. You know, we talked a little bit about hydrophobicity, but there are a lot of other effects to the soils from a very severe burn. our native tree species, fortunately, they're very fire adapted. They're very resilient to fire. They've grown up in a Mediterranean climate where they've experienced hot, dry summers, and fire is often combined with that hot, dry summers impact the species. Native American burning practices done for eons, frequent understory burns, and allowed natural fires to burn. So the adaptations that a lot of our species have developed, they have thick bark, so they can withstand fire when it nears the bark. They resprout either at the base or epicomically or roots, and they can recover from loss of their entire leaves or needles. So their entire canopy can be lost, but they can recover. And if they lose a portion of their stem or canopy, same thing, they can also recover. Most of our oak species, many of them have very thick bark, so that's a great adaptation to fire. And then they all resprout. So after a fire comes through, you're likely to see, even if a standing oak is entirely top killed, there will be resprouts at the base. And then we have many additional resprouting species, including redwood, tan oak, madrone bay, and then some non-natives as well, like eucalypt. So first year post-fire, some of the things to look for. Tree mortality is not immediately evident, oftentimes that first year. A lot of that, you'll see leaf needle loss, and as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't mean the tree is dead. Sometimes you have to wait till the spring to know what has survived, and then a couple slides ahead, I'm going to talk about other ways to see if your trees have suffered mortality. And as I mentioned, the sprouting species, so after a fire, a lot of our species do come back from fire. So for mortality, one way of estimating mortality of oaks is, as I mentioned, the bark is fairly thick, and they can lose bark or portions of the bark, but it's the cambium that is of real concern for oaks. So if they lose that live tissue layer beneath the bark, that's when they can die. One way to check this is just taking a hatchet at the base of the tree, just pulling back the bark a little bit. If it's pink or white, and that's a sign that the tree is still alive. If it's dark or yellowish and dry to the touch, that's a sign that the tree is dead. However, if there's only 10% of the cambium remaining, an oak tree can still survive. So as I mentioned earlier, very resilient. It's best just to wait to see what is and can recover. Douglas fir, they're also fairly resilient, not quite as resilient as oaks or redwoods. But one way of checking the mortality on them is simply looking at the crown. So the graphic on the left, you've got the orange portion, which is crown killed during a fire, and then the green is the live crown prior to the fire. So one way to estimate mortality of Douglas fir is if you basically divide the crown killed part by the live crown. Let's say the crown killed part was 50 feet, the live crown prior to fire was 75 feet. That would give us 66, which over here, if you look at the table on the right, that would tell us then that the tree has a probability to die of 50%. 50%, I think we leave a tree standing. A pretty good chance. It could go obviously one of two ways. There's also a bunch of other mortality assessments that can be done for other species. This one's a lot more involved. You've got 4 different categories you've got to check when you're out there in the forest. And all 3 of these documents that I've covered here with mortality, I'll be adding those to the chat if anybody's interested in looking at them. But essentially for redwood, which is I think what this one is more useful for than most others, you'd have to look at the percent canopy remaining, percent canopy sprouting, and then the system of the root, or percent of root system missing, and versus digging through the ground to check on what's there and what's not there. A simple way is just if there's a hollowed out base around a redwood, that's a good sign that you're missing a root system in that portion. And then versus the oak, where I showed checking the cambium in one portion for redwoods to see whether they're suffered mortality, you'd actually need to check all 4 quadrants to see what portion of that cambium is dead or live. So some practice recommendations post-fire recovery. As similar to Kristen and Rich, a lot of times that first period of time, short-term focus, really best to do nothing. You don't know what's fully dead. You don't know what's going to survive. Short-term focus, you want to look more at the hazard trees, those in danger of falling on structures or roads, and looking at defensible sites, which is a 100-foot radius surrounding structures. The as things progress, majority of fire-killed snags on a property, they'll remain standing for less than 10 years. So in the longer term, this larger fuel sometimes falls to the ground and becomes fuel. And so there's heavier fuel loading on the forest floor. And while they're standing, they're serving as a ladder fuel for any regrowth. So it's important to kind of consider the snags as well. One recommendation, technical assistance recommendation, you're often going to get landowners that are interested in pursuing a salvage harvest. And that's timber harvest of dead, dying, and damaged trees from wildfire. CAL FIRE has a post-fire recovery exemption, which essentially streamlines, speeds up the process of harvesting a site that's been impacted by fire. If they are interested in pursuing a salvage harvest, I would provide a list of registered professional foresters to the interested party, and some recommendations in terms of salvage harvest. Typically, it's larger forest acreages, so properties that are bigger than 50 acres. A lot of high tree mortality suffered for that forested site, mixed fire severity, and average tree DBH around 12 inches. If they do pursue a salvage harvest and they're interested in the NRCS programs, I suggest following up EQIP post-salvage harvest. A lot of times when you have licensed timber operators, so the loggers essentially, to do the salvage harvest, they're paid on the amount of material they get out, so the volume of wood that they're removed from the site. They're not really focused on conservation-focused practices. I think sometimes it's easier with the slash that's remaining after a salvage harvest to know what we can treat and how we can help. And then practice recommendations. As a forester, I'm always thinking about the future. Forests, of course, they have longer lifespans than we do, so we have to kind of think in mind or look ahead in terms of how they're managed. So the practice recommendations long-term that I more consider is forest stand improvement, woody residue treatment, tree shrub site prep, brush management, and tree shrub establishment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about a few of these. Forest stand improvement, the graphic here is pretty representative of the concerns we have in a lot of our forests, where they're very overcrowded, fires come through, kills off everything, and there may be a chance that it may convert into a different vegetation type. A lot of times we don't want that to happen. So we're looking on thinning out the dead, dying, and damaged trees, creating space to plant maybe other species or help the sprouting species come back and be the species that recover the site. Eventually, we're hoping a lot of these forests, we can get to a point where we can get thinning and burning treatments and open up those forests so that they have the space to grow, and everything is a little bit better. So for woody residue treatment, it's essentially the forest stand improvement is thinning the standing vegetation. Woody residue treatment is treating that downed, thin material, down dead, damaged trees, other vegetation. Ways to do this would either be through a chipper, masticator, pile and burn, or lap and scatter, especially on steeper slopes. The typical scenario for NRCS, our post-fire scenario with woody residue treatment, is the restoration conservation treatment following catastrophic events. If there are any questions on that, NRCS, people can definitely reach out, and I can add a bit more information on that. And then tree shrub site preparation. So a lot of the sites, you're going to have a lot of slash, perhaps some invasive species, and a lot of competition for seedlings that you want to be the ones you focus on in recovery. So helping those seedlings along by providing them a bit more space or treating invasive species to, again, open up space, growing space for the seedlings you want to recover the site are all fairly important things. And tree shrub establishment. So this is just planting species back in the landscape. Post-fire, where you're going to look at this is more sites with no seed sources. Seed sources, so the seed bank might have been consumed by fire, and there's few sprouting. A lot of times there's no need to replant a lot of the sites, particularly in our our region just because there's so many sprouting species. So there's no need to overstock your site by planting more than what may come back naturally. I'm going to go through some examples of sites and maybe what could be done given a site. So this situation, clearly high fire severity, high soil burn severity, might even be some pockets of hydrophobicity out there. So the site recovery, clearly there would be no need for a salvage harvest. Nothing much remaining there. There likely may not be any native seed resources remaining. You really have to check through the soil to see that. Invasive species. So if they were present before the fire, they're going to come back with a vengeance after fire. So these are really important things to ask a landowner if they've had invasive species there before. So practice recommendations in this case, if there's no seed sources remaining, either prepping the site if necessary, if there is something that's coming back or invasive species, and then planting back with tree shrub. So in this next one, example of low fire severity, low soil burn severity. So no need for a salvage harvest. Trees aren't impacted. Fire didn't do much to the standing trees, and even a lot of the understory probably wasn't impacted much. So little to no tree mortality. Seed sources are probably still existing. The fire wasn't impactful enough to kill the cones or seeds. And there might even be live vegetation and stump sprouting that would pop back up. So practice recommendations, depending on if the understory species died or if there were some fire impacted things a bit more than maybe what this picture shows. You could do a bit of forest stand improvement, treat some of the woody residue, and then perhaps tree shrub pruning to limb up the branches and lessen the ladder fuels in this forest. So this here, another site example. This was fire impacted by the 2017 Tubbs fire. And so it was a mixed fire severity, which is really going to be quite common for what you see out there in the landscape. Low to higher soil burn severity. And the picture on the top right, it's a wider photo of a site. You can see a lot of the redwoods survived, a lot of the Doug fir did not. So there's a lot of gray to light colored dead vegetation intermixed with the redwoods. And then when you get up in the forest, these pictures are when you're standing in. So there's tan oaks resprouting heavily, redwoods resprouting heavily. So it's something to consider. So you've got the standing dead plus that resprouts coming back, which again is a potential future wildfire concern. So it's something for down the road to be considering. And this picture, all these pictures are 2 years post-fire. There was no salvage harvest. There just wasn't enough material really for them to pursue it, and not good access routes for any of that. Moderate to high tree mortality. There were not too many seed sources remaining. The fire did impact a lot of the Douglas fir cones, but there's a lot of stump sprouting. So there really would be no need to plant in this situation. The practice recommendations: you could remove the dead, dying, and damaged trees, some of the standing snags, to lessen that fuel loading, treating all that thin material, and also treating those sprouts. So reducing the number of sprouts, potentially 2 to 3 in a clump, so that they're the focus, that more of the energy that those trees are producing can be put towards those sprouts. The overstock condition, the problems with that are lessened as well. And then tree shrub site preparation as well, or even brush management, trying to keep those sprouts back so that we're keeping the stand stocked in ways that help with wildfire. And then this last one, so it's a high fire severity, a moderate to high soil burn severity. This was the Kincaid fire back in October. So this picture is about 9 months post-fire. You can see the tree crowns, everything's dead, so near 100% mortality there. These landowners are pursuing a salvage harvest, and there's likely no seed sources remaining just because of the soil burn severity. So post-salvage, what we would probably come in to do, there could be a lot of slash remaining on the site. The woody residue treatment, treating that downed, dead, and dying and damaged material, and then prepping the site to plant back trees and get your forest on the path to recovery. So general summary, our native species are adapted to fire. They're very resilient. A lot of them are going to come back. so it's not always an issue that we need to think about replanting. Fire impacts are very site specific. You're not always going to see the same thing for every parcel you go to or every landowner you meet up with. In the short term, focus should be on hazard trees and defensible space. Tree mortality is not immediately evident. Most fire-killed snags remain standing for less than 10 years, so it's something to think about long-term with fuel loading. Species which resprout do so vigorously following fire. I think the picture of the tan oak and redwood show that very well. And because of this, you could have a high fuel buildup post-fire. So a lot of standing dead, a lot of ground fuels, resprouts, ladder fuels coming back up, and then you could have invasive species as well. So long term, we don't want to get to a spot where the wildfire threat is equal or even worse than it was before the fire came true. So some other general recommendations: leaving some snags. They're great for wildlife habitat, providing forest structure, and then eventually, of course, woody debris on the forest floor. To reduce future wildfire threat, though, I think there's a good idea to thin and treat some of those fire-killed snags, avoid high fuel load buildups, prune the basal sprouts to promote better regrowth of remaining sprouts, replant where no seed sources remaining or resprouting species are not found, and prepare forest land for next wildfire. It's a fire-prone environment we live in, and chances are we're going to see it again. So maintaining proper spacing with the species we have out there, removing the ladder fuels, and then if we can, getting to a maintenance phase where we're thinking about prescribed fire, mechanical means to keep those fuels down, chemical, or even prescribed grazing. That's all I have.
Thank you, Jeff. We do have a few questions that have come in. One is about climate change and trees' resiliency, ability to regenerate. So maybe if there's something to think about in terms of a shift in zones where certain trees might be best suited. Is that changing due to climate change? And that kind of goes into the other question about planting monocultures and thinking about diversity in the replanting if we are going in to do an active replanting.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing to think about. We often don't know exactly what's going to make it down the line, but I think planting a diverse mix of species out there is always best, just in case something does get hit pretty hard by climate change. A lot of the times we'd still provide the e-veg guide. I don't think that has climate change as a part of it, so I don't know how many choices there would be for what they'd plant. But I think choosing outside the seed zones it's a worthwhile thing to consider.
All right, thanks. And then one last question before we move to the Q&A. Could you please speak to contour felling and limbing versus lop and scatter, and the role of large woody debris versus small wood in future fire risk?
So the larger the wood, the more fuel there is for future fire. So sometimes we want to treat the larger material as well as we can. Contour felling, I think maybe I'll have Rich speak to that one, but there are cases where that could be beneficial, depending on the situation, how steep the slopes are, the soil burn severity for a given site. But oftentimes lop and scatter can serve that same purpose and then provide a little more room for water to drain naturally.
Okay, great. There was one last question that came in about the high density areas where there was a high density of stump resprouting, and would that need immediate treatment, or would competition for light and resources eventually thin that out?
I would suggest treatment, especially the longer you let it go, the harder it is to treat. So a lot of times in the first 2 to 5 years, you could actually treat a lot of these sprouts without a chainsaw. You could just take loppers out and lop back the sprouts until you have 2 to 3 that you prefer on that site. Over the long term, they will self-thin, and there will be some natural mortality that takes place. But then that mortality is standing dead as well. So, I definitely would suggest treating the sprouts and within that first 5-year window.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Jeff and Kristen for those deep dives on forest lands and rangelands. We really appreciate that. I have done a poor job in keeping time. We've only got a few more minutes until our noon stop time, but I do want to get to Drew. Drew Loganbill is our district conservationist in Petaluma and has had experience with fires over in the wine country area in recent years. And Drew is going to share some lessons learned with us. Drew, I don't know if you have slides to share.
Yeah, I do. Hold on, let me pop it up here.
All right.
Hopefully it's working. So I'll try to go through this quick because I know we're almost out of time here, and hopefully we could I could answer some questions. But I have been working with fire for a while. Back in 2009, when I was getting my master's, my thesis project burnt up in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and so I really switched my thesis topic to looking at post-fire erosion. So one of the takeaways I just want to share with that was, helping evaluate when erosion is really going to be an issue. And through that study, the sites that had most erosion had high burn severity. The fuel types were more chaparral, where they burn really hot. They're on the south-facing slopes and very high slope percentage. And the sites that really unraveled the most showed signs of hydrophobicity. And the key factor was really the rainfall intensity. And that's what, when we got rainfalls that were, at or above 1 inches per hour, that's when we really saw things starting to move. So, I think as we go out and really work with landowners and really evaluating sites, these are all certain things that we might want to look for. If you are interested in hydrophobicity and testing that, there's a quick test you could do. It's called the water drop penetration time test. And essentially you dig down 1 to 3 meters depth, and you can do different depths if you'd like. And you essentially just kind of put a few drops of water on a flat platform that you dig out, and time how long it takes. If it takes longer than 5 minutes for it to infiltrate, or maybe it won't after 5 minutes, then you're going to see the signs of hydrophobicity. A couple things to watch out during doing that test is if there's any ash present on the surface that you dig out, it's going to absorb the water extremely fast. So it's going to, affect your results on that. And as well as little micropores where, if you notice it's going down one little insect hole, then you're going to definitely have an issue with that. So, but otherwise, when you're looking at these sites, and if they do show these signs, and bare soil, white ash is another way to, see if it burnt really hot. I think, you really want to look at, okay, if we are going to have sheet and rail erosion, where is it going to go? Is it going to concentrate somewhere and cause larger erosion because you're going to have higher amount of runoff? One thing I did notice is we had some areas that had some massive sheet and rail erosion. But a lot of that sediment ended up depositing on, old skid roads, or maybe even access roads, or even on the floodplains before it got into the creek. So a lot of the sediment did deposit out before it entered creeks, and before it really had major impacts on maybe salmonid habitat, or I think the biggest scare is having major debris flows that could have some high impact. So these are kind of the things you want to look at, and in order to really determine what the further down the watershed impacts would be, and what's in front of you and what you might want to treat. Moving on from there, I think a lot of this is a bit of a recap of what was said, but knowing your vegetation types, as Jeff just mentioned, we live in an ecosystem that's adapted to fire. So I think a lot of times is looking at the future fuel load. This photo on this one is just the spring after the Hubs fire. So this is the Oak Woodland area, but you can see the grass came back really well. I would say this was definitely a lower burn severity, but things come back quick. And I think one thing with climate change, and I did see a question in there about climate change and how one thing I'm noticing is that we're having fire return intervals that are much closer together than they might have been historically. And one thing that I think we could do is try to prepare. And so if we do have fire come back, that it's not going to be catastrophic again. The impacts where we have these fire resistant species but if you have fire come back too quick, they might not be able to rebound. So another things to think about. And then one additional species, which I'm not sure was mentioned too much, is broom species, like French broom or Scotch broom, seem to really be fire followers and can really just come in as a carpet. So that's another invasive species to think about, because those could come into really a brushy type and be, again, some pretty intense future fuels. And I think last couple of things, for site visits, again, safety first. I think Rich covered the safety aspects really well. I think the one thing that's really kind of scared me out in the field is going out on a windy day after a fire. Those trees are rattling around, the branches are breaking. Hard hats are really important, but know the weather conditions before you go out. And if you feel unsafe, get out of there. I've definitely left some forested areas before because of wind. And then, when working with landowners, just be really sensitive. Everyone takes these experiences differently. I think we're living in the areas in the North Bay here that we've seen wildfires come through multiple times. It seems like almost every year, it seems like we have some major catastrophic wildfire in the area. And, I think these repeated times I'm seeing people getting infected in different ways, and they're much more sensitive. But I think it's important that we don't want to be pushy on doing some of these best management practices, but more so, answer their questions, provide some resources. And I think it's always a good idea to follow up in writing, whether it's an email or whatever it may be. But a lot of times people get, they're processing, so they're not going to take in all the information we talk to them about. So following up in writing with resources is really important. And then, again, if we're going out and working with landowners, it's really important to take some good notes, GPS and photos. What I found a lot of times we go out and we talk about a lot of different things, but they want to come back in for programs. And when you have all those, if you take really good notes and have good documentation of damage and things like that, that could be really helpful in, helping them with different programs that might be available for fire recovery. And it's also good, there's a plethora of handouts out there, but it's good to know what your handouts are and have them ready, so then you can really give the ones that are going to make most sense. And the last thing, coordination with partners is really good. So make sure we're sharing the same message, and then the resources are in either one location, or if they are in multiple locations, they're the same resources. I think I've heard complaints of landowners having to jump websites and not knowing where to go, and they can't find all the right information. So we hit 12 o'clock, so I'll end there.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined us. I guess I'll take the liberty of saying, if folks want to stay on and do some question and answer, maybe we stay on for another 10 minutes. For those of you who need to leave, thank you for being here. I'm sorry I did not do a great job keeping us on time. But if you would like to stay on and do some question and answer, we can stay on for another 10 minutes. Would that be all right, Kay? Hopefully Kay can find her mute button. There we go. Yeah. All right. So let's see, if you want to ask a question, I would say just unmute yourself, and we'll try hard not to talk over each other. And if you're addressing a specific speaker, maybe make that clear as you're asking your question. And so they can get themselves unmuted. There were also some good comments that were shared in the chat as we went on. I did not bring those up because I figured everybody could see them. But Tanya is saying that she's having trouble accessing the files. We will gather these files up and make sure that each of the RCDs, Yolo, Solano, and Napa have copies that we'll either try to set up a Google Drive, something like that, or get them on the website for everyone. All right, it looked like someone raised their hand. If you want to go ahead and ask a question, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Jeff Rafe Snyder. I have a question for Kristen. I didn't hear you correctly. Did you say that no-till drilling of seeds was good or bad for seed to soil contact?
It's good. So with the no-till drill, it's actually putting in, the seed is getting drilled into the soil, into the upper layer of the soil, so it's protected. So that's a good thing. It's when you broadcast is problematic because you're not getting that good seed soil contact. And it's also, when it's left on top, you also have, there's birds, you name it, you could lose the seed that you've put on.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is Corinne in Lakeport. I have more just a comment, I guess, or maybe a question for you Area 2 foresters. But we are running into a seed supply shortage for conifer species. So I don't know if that's something you guys are running into. It's something that we're having to take into consideration in planning projects, though. We've completely exhausted all of our local seed zones and their seed supply at CAL FIRE. And we've had to go to adjacent seed zones, and then now we're looking way beyond that. So something that I've definitely had to consider in planning forest projects.
Corinne, this is Drew. I think that's a really good comment. And I think with the widespread fires we're having across the state, it's going to be a major issue. I know from our past fires, we've been fairly lucky in Sonoma County, at least, where it's been mostly hardwood dominated forest. And now I think the most recent fires we have are more mixed conifer, but with redwood being a dominant species, which all pretty much come back. So we haven't had a huge need, but there has been efforts to collect acorns locally, and so there's been some oak replanting efforts in that sense. So I think that would be something, is, partners might want to coordinate on, trying to collect seed and preparing for the future, because I think statewide it's going to be a real big issue. And I know, I helped you out there in the Valley Fire, and there's major mortality, and that's more common in the fir and pine. And especially if it burns hot, the seed source on the ground might be gone. So yeah, I think that's a really good comment, and something that we all need to think about, and how we could prepare for that.
And I guess kind of not quite along the same lines, but the other thing that I have been observing is in these marginal conifer sites that may have supported ponderosa pine prior to the fire, and that was, they were maybe a mixed pine oak. Right on the margins where you find the conifer trees, I'm finding that reforesting those sites with conifer trees is much less successful than, may previously, and kind of attribute that to these hotter, drier climates. But it's something that, another thing that I'm starting to take into consideration when planning, where we're planting, is just because it had, ponderosa pine before doesn't necessarily mean that it wants to support it in the future.
Thanks for that comment, Corinne. Is there anyone else who has a question?
This is Sebastian in Petaluma. I was just wondering, with the EQIP programs or whatever other programs that we can use in the NRCS, is there any sort of expedited process for getting those projects on the ground for fire recovery, or is it just the normal EQIP sort of timeline?
Kay, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. Actually, Carlos got a message yesterday from his boss, Esther Boozer, about the possibility of an early CAT fire sign up. So it's something that the leadership team is going to be talking about on Monday at our set call. So we're looking at that.
Thanks, Kay. I know our timelines do not fit with the landowners' feeling of urgency. I mean, rarely do they fit ever, but right now, really, they don't. Yeah, having it sooner rather than later would be great. All right, any other questions out there?
I've got another question. This has to do with buffer strips that break up slope length. Should we put down straw only, or should we put down some sterile seed, like right after the first fall rain? And I'm also wondering about the width of these buffer strips. I was looking at one site, and it looked like it would benefit where there were slope breaks and where there would be a hydraulic jump. And I've heard some talk about don't plant rye because it's an invasive, but I've heard that there might be some sterile seed out there that we could plant. So I'm wondering what to plant, if anything at all, and how wide the strip should be. And this is probably for Rich Cassell or anyone who knows.
Thanks for that question, Jeff. Yeah, it's kind of by fire, in terms of coming up with a seed mix. The RCD in Santa Cruz County are working with 2 different seed dealers to come up with a local native post-fire seed mix, along with 2 nurse crops of a sterile triticale and wheat, I guess, so that you have something that comes up quickly, because so many of the natives are slower to germinate. They're mostly perennials, but there's with some exceptions. But for the most part, the seeding where it is necessary, the natives are going to really help out later on in the winter, early spring, and in the second year following fire. So it's good to get something out there quick where we are recommending seeding, and, to find those grass seeds that are not going to be invasive and that are localized and adaptable to your situation.
Is there a way to determine strip widths? Like it used to be easy with USLE back in the old days, but is it kind of a guess and by gosh thing that we make a, 100-foot wide strip or a 50-foot wide strip?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure if there's a formula out there. I mean, if you're going to do strips rather than seed an entire area, then breaking any long slope down into smaller parts is going to help. And you get to a point where it's time, money, and effort, or you get to a point of you're trying to lessen your impact on that slope as well. So I guess, again, I hate the answer of it all depends how steep it is and how long it is, and how seriously it was impacted. Like I said, if you can't afford to do the whole thing, and as I said, it may not be necessary anyway, but at least one contour strip or cross strip at some point in the landscape. I've always just used kind of a 10-foot wide as something to work from. But like I said, anything is probably better than nothing in the situations where that's applicable.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rich. And we're now at 10 minutes past our time, so I'm going to call it. Again, thank you all for being here. Just as a reminder, we focused on technical today, but there will be an additional training next Tuesday to talk about programs. So if you really want to dig in deep on the USDA programs to understand those better, please join us again next Tuesday. If you need an invite you can email me and I will get you on the invite list. Thank you again for coming. And let's, I hope we all are able to get out there and help those folks who have their burned landscapes that need some healing. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks all. Thank you to all our speakers.